Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today is part 2 of our 3-part series on marriage and money. And one of the things that I may have left you with coming out of last week as I talked about this idea of becoming one, of moving towards this oneness of experience around money is how do we do that when we're so different? I highlighted last week this difference of the go and the woe, this natural structure that God has built. I've never seen a marriage that wasn't founded on 2 different people. I've never seen a relationship that doesn't have that tension. Marriage is built as a way to show us our own tendencies, our own selfishness, and over time to refine us and bring us more and more into this union. It starts a lot of times with a lot of rocky, a lot of harsh, a lot of strained experiences because we're still very much who we always have been, and we're bringing together in relationship who we always have been. And this is the case with money in particular. I mean, most marriages are coming from 2 very different experiences with money. Families have a lot of different baggage around money, whether one spouse grew up and experienced a lot of lack. They struggled. They were always fearful, always scrimping and avoiding spending because they didn't have enough. And so they tend to come out of that experience seeing any spending as wasteful, seeing anything that feels even remotely close to self-indulgent as irresponsible. And then you marry someone who comes out of an experience where there was plenty, or at least there was the impression of plenty. You know, sometimes those families, they didn't have the money, but they were spending it anyway. Maybe they had a very lax view of debt and said, it's fine, it's no big deal. And you bring that experience, that understanding of how money works into relationship. And so, it's really hard to become one when you're so different. But I actually think that's part of God's design. I think that He puts us in relationship with people who in many ways are our opposite in order to bring change, in order to move us into a different version, a different thought around how we experience these resources. You know, one of the transitions that I think is really important for couples to go through in marriage is to let go of how I do money or how my family did money, and then move to a decision of how we as a family will do money. It's just another version of mine and yours versus ours. You know, my family did this, your family did that, and that brings us then to this isolation, this separation, just like treating finances separately does. But if we start to recognize that a lot of those tendencies that I may see in you, that I'm frustrated by or that seem counter to my experience, came from somewhere. Those attitudes, those motivations that drive your financial decisions or drive what you want to spend money on, those all came from your life experience, as did mine. And when we come together, we can grow in our understanding of why we are the way we are and then intentionally decide how we will be going forward as a couple. And I know that sounds really hard, and that's because it is. I wish this was easy. I wish this took no time. I've not seen this go quickly. This is an evolution, a constant movement away from what we came from and towards something we're picking up intentionally. And that takes a lot of growth. It takes a lot of strain. It takes a lot of frustration. I think of friction and how it can kind of rub out some of the sharp edges. We need some of that friction in order to change. And so in couples, a lot of times we will see one of those couples becomes the money person just because they're really good at it, or they came from a family that was really good at it, or they think they're really good at it even if they're not. And the other spouse just kind of concedes that role and checks out. But because they check out, that means they don't have understanding, they don't have clarity, they don't feel like they're part of these decisions. There's just the money person and the non-money person. And I don't think that's a great place to be. I don't want us to abdicate our oneness because one of us might be better at this than the other. We still should be coming together and making decisions and framing these things as a single decision-making unit, as one. The tension that we see in couples is this problem of seeing money through different lenses, and those lenses were placed on us by our family of origin. They were placed on us by our experiences that we've had through life that have framed us and shaped us. And those experiences are a gift if we understand them. A lot of times we see those things as something we judge. Either we judge and resent our family for having brought us through that situation. We judge them for not handling it better. We forget how much we've learned from that experience. Or as the observer, we may judge those decisions. Maybe we're married to someone who's motivated by enjoyment. They want to go and do and have fun. And so we see their spending as frivolous and selfish. But when we seek to understand what that motivation is rooted in, rather than seeking to judge them or diminish them or just control them, we can grow in how we can harness some of that motivation for delight and happiness and beauty into something we can share, rather than this thing that I look at and resent or am frustrated by while I'm over here making decisions that you resent and are frustrated by, right? We end up in this constant vicious cycle that reinforces itself when we look at these things with resentment and judgment. What I want us to do is help couples move to a place of understanding. Where did these things come from? When we see people who are struggling with debt, they're overspending, they spend beyond their means, they may have come from an experience where they didn't have any background or any understanding of how things were purchased, what things cost. They were blinded by that. And oftentimes we will see people they've lived an experience, a life experience that they can't afford themselves, but they have no reference point for what that life costs. And so they just assume everybody can afford it. I got to drive a new car when I was a kid, so why can't I drive a new car now? You know, when you grow up in a situation where there was plenty or the impression of plenty, the assumption is there's plenty. And so we need to seek to understand where these things are coming from rather than dismissing them. Because when we have shared understanding of what we're both bringing to the table, if I grew up in a family where there was a lack and I am deeply motivated by security, I want so badly to always make sure there's enough because we didn't have enough. And so I am the response to that childhood. If that's the experience I'm bringing, then I'm going to be forcing control and forcing lack of spending and making sure we don't enjoy anything so that we can hoard and protect ourselves and make sure we're okay. And if I'm married to someone who's motivated to enjoy and experience, that person is constantly going to be butting heads with me. But what they're really butting heads with is what I brought. What we need to do is understand those things and then decide together as we turn to our future, who are we going to be going forward? What of this delight and motivation to have experiences do we want to keep? What does that look like for us? We know what it looked like for you growing up, but what does it look like for us now? And this desire for security and for safety and a sense of having enough, I understand where that came from, but what is enough? How do we harness that desire to be responsible and protect ourselves, but also balance it against the tendency to oversave and overaccumulate and miss all these other things that we want? That is the hard work, and I think it's the work that most couples don't do. They tend to maintain what they brought because it's what they're used to, it's what seems familiar, and it's what seems right. And now we're arguing over who's right. And that is a really, really destructive argument. The truth is, both of you are right and both of you are wrong. Somewhere embedded in that motivation for safety is a healthy thing, to be responsible and make sure you have enough for future obedience. And somewhere embedded in that desire for enjoyment and delight is something beautiful and wonderful. And so how do we harness these things instead of just resenting them and having them be constant source of conflict? The way we do that is by first seeking to understand where they came from and allow it to make sense. Allow it to kind of frame for us an explanation for why so many of these things keep popping up. The truth is that most parents don't disciple their kids well when it comes to faithful stewardship. And so we are always bringing some mutated, broken form of this into the marriage relationship. Sometimes those pieces can fit together well, but most of the time they tend to fit together awkwardly. They tend to fit together in ways that actually create a lot of strife and frustration. But when we seek to understand these things, we can recognize them for what they are. Patterns of behavior that were framed in us from a very young age, and we can actually move towards new patterns. We can decide ahead of time how we're going to show up going forward. So questions to be asking as you think about this is, what was money like in your family as you grew up? How did your family handle it? Was there one person in charge and the other person didn't have any clue? Was there a shared conversation, or was there kind of more of a control type of relationship? Did your parents ever involve you as a kid in the conversations and the decisions they were making? What was it like? How did you experience money as you look back? And how has that framed you? Generally, it frames you one of two ways. You repeat what was done. You do the same thing. You see it as good and right, and you just do it again. Or you're a reaction to it. You're the opposite. You go as far in the other direction as possible. You know, if my parents had plenty and there was always more than enough to go around, and they spent, with no recognition of responsibility, I may look at that and say that was self-indulgent, it was selfish, and I may become a reaction to that. If my parents were super restrictive and constantly scared, and they were always worried about money, and there was no value to that worry, and I saw what it stole from them, what it stole from our family, I could be a reaction to that, and I could become reckless. I could become irresponsible because I don't even want to deal with the consequences of the fear and the anxiety that I saw in my parents. And so we need to understand where those motivations lie, what that behavior is coming from, so that we can recognize which of those camps we fall in. Are we repeating? Are we reacting? Are we doing the same thing? Are we doing the opposite thing that we saw modeled to us as a kid? Once we've done the work to understand how those experiences have shaped us, then we can turn to understand what those motivations look like for us. And most people are motivated by a consistent motivator. They have a constant theme in their money decisions. And we actually have an assessment that we'll link to in the show notes that'll help you figure out what your motivation is. But one of them is love or devotion, right? This is the relationship piece. People are motivated to just shower others, to care for others, to provide for others. They want others to never feel pain, even if it means I go without. I always want you to have plenty. And so they're motivated in ways that can a lot of times go overboard in order to care for other people. They can be motivated by security. And that security motivation is rooted in self-protection and making sure there's enough. And a lot of times we see people who are security motivated as good with money because they are so intentional to make sure they don't overspend. And a lot of times they end up being the money person in the relationship through a power struggle that doesn't actually take very long. They just decide, I'm going to make sure we're safe, and so I'm in charge. And that can become a really difficult dynamic in the relationship. The other motivation is freedom or enjoyment. These are the people who, like I talked about earlier, want to just experience. They want the freedom to go and have fun and do the things, and they're constantly fighting to get more so they can do more. And then the last motivation that we see is power, that people see money as the ability to have influence on others, to make decisions, to move things that they want to move. And it's true, money can be a source of power and authority, and that motivator means that we tend to drive harder, we tend to climb higher, we tend to want to be in positions of authority and strength. And a lot of times we get there by having more and more wealth. And so those are motivations that you can already hear as I walk through them. There are things that are helpful in all of them, and there are things that are really potentially toxic. And when you bring those different motivations into relationship with each other, the fireworks go off. That's the tension. And so we need couples to recognize where it comes from and what it leaves them with. Right? If this is where it came from, all these experiences, then it leaves me with this motivation where I'm constantly seeking security or I'm constantly driving for enjoyment. That's where it came from, so it makes sense. And that's why we keep having this same conflict. We keep fighting over these same things because I'm always going to be motivated by enjoyment and you're always going to be motivated by devotion and love. And those things are going to come into tension because we can't do both of those all the time. We have to pick. Once we know what those motivators are that are driving a lot of our decisions, then we can start to build on our shared agreements as a couple. We've gained understanding of where this all comes from, why we keep running up against these conflicts, and now we can decide what of those motivators are valuable. What of those aspects of being motivated by enjoyment are worth keeping? What are the things we do want to do as a family? And the enjoyment motivated person is going to pull us into that, away from that fear and security. What are the things that the love motivated person or the devotion motivated person are going to push us towards that allow us to love others well without enabling them or having them become codependent on us, or putting them in a position where they can stay irresponsible and unfaithful in their stewardship because we keep bailing them out, right? What are those lines that we're drawing in how we express that love and devotion in our finances as a couple? How are we going to influence things? What is that power motivator? If one of us is motivated by power, where are we going to draw the lines on this is helpful, this is moving things forward, this is a cause we care about and we want to be deeply involved and we want to make a difference, and that's helpful. That's a win for us as a couple. And that line will help us determine how we stay involved in those things rather than becoming overly focused on winning more and more power. And so the process is really one of seeing what that story that God used to shape us has has formed in us in terms of that core motivation, and how we team those motivations up as a couple in order to bring out the best of each other in a shared vision, shared direction, rather than constantly fighting over the parts of that behavior that we resent. Because that conflict is not moving us forward. It's moving us further away. It's moving us further apart. It's creating distance and frustration and resentment and contempt. And those are really destructive things that aren't money's fault. We hear all the time that money is the number one reason for divorce. These are the reasons. It's this deeper underlying relational tension that's rooted in different motivations. It's rooted in different family dynamics coming through childhood and growing into adulthood. We have been framed by a lot of those things, shaped by a lot of those things. We need to leave those things and become one and decide who we are going to be as a family, as a couple, and what direction we're going to head. We can harness the best of those different motivations in order to make sure we actually hit the target together, rather than fighting over who's right and resenting our differences. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.